Hello and welcome. I'm Matthew Stone, and this is WarScope Intelligence, your fast, focused briefing on the stories shaping global security. Facts before opinions. Timeline before takes. In the next few minutes, you are getting everything: what happened, what is unfolding right now, and where this is almost certainly heading. What you do with that is entirely up to you. Unconditional surrender. Those are three words that sound decisive, final, almost cinematic. But here is the real question nobody in the media is asking. Does anyone actually believe them? Because if the most debated mystery surrounding the Iran conflict is what drove the United States to launch it, the second most debated mystery is quietly far more consequential. When does it stop? And more importantly, how? The mainstream conversation around that question keeps making the same critical error. It ignores the foundational rule of how wars actually terminate. A conflict ends only when the fighting itself resolves the underlying problem that ignited it. Master that single principle, and you will instantly be able to separate intelligent analysis from noise. So here is what we are going to do. First, dismantle the false endings, the headlines people think will stop this war but won't. Then, examine whether a military outcome is even achievable. And finally, explore the one mechanism that history tells us actually ends most wars. But the false endings come first. The thread running through every bad prediction about this war's termination is the same. For anything to change, the battlefield must generate information that genuinely surprises the decision-makers. Not the general public, who may not have been paying close attention before the first strike. The surprise has to land inside the Pentagon. It has to shake the State Department. It has to recalibrate something inside the White House. Outcomes that were fully anticipated before the first bomb fell do not move the needle at all. Think about it this way. You do not return a car because you discovered you have to buy fuel for it. That cost was built into your decision the moment you signed the paperwork. The same logic applies here. Every consequence now flooding the news cycle was already priced into the war plan before the war began. Start with the Strait of Hormuz. Any analyst who has spent more than a week studying Iranian geopolitics knew this was coming the instant a major confrontation became likely. Fuel prices climbing sharply as the strait tightens. That was not a surprise. That was a forecast. For that development to actually pressure the war toward an ending, you would need a crisis on the scale of the 1970s oil embargo, the kind of economic shock that forces governments to fundamentally recalculate. A noticeable spike at the pump is uncomfortable. It is not a civilization-altering disruption. The war continues. The stock market sliding on the back of energy uncertainty and geopolitical anxiety, also not a surprise. Also already built into every serious pre-war analysis. The S&P 500 dropping 2% in a single week is the kind of thing that happens during an ordinary earnings season. To shift the trajectory of an active military campaign, you need a genuine bear market, the type of sustained collapse that seizes the entire economic conversation. That has not happened. The war continues. Then there is the cost. Reports are now circulating that this operation is burning through roughly $1 billion per day. Here is what those reports leave out. There was a team inside the Pentagon that calculated exactly that figure before a single sortie was flown. The daily burn rate was not a revelation. It was a budget line. The war continues, so civilian casualties will not end it either. Tragic in every individual case, and history does not let anyone look away from that reality. But 20-plus years of operations across Afghanistan and Iraq established a brutal precedent. Washington absorbs those moments, investigates when forced to, and presses forward. No AI-enhanced targeting architecture eliminates the garbage-in, garbage-out problem at the core of any intelligence-driven strike system. Faulty inputs produce faulty outcomes regardless of how sophisticated the weapon is. And when Iranian state media amplifies casualty figures, apply the same skepticism you learned to apply to Russian battlefield reporting out of Ukraine. Some of those reports will contain truth. None of them will end the war on their own. Gradual American casualties will not end it. The arithmetic of attrition only becomes politically dangerous if it accelerates dramatically or produces a singular catastrophic event, something on the scale of losing an aircraft carrier. A slow, steady drip of losses, as grim as that sounds, was written into the operational assumptions from day one. Shrinking weapons stockpiles were also baked in, since the entire strategy revolves around sustained bombardment. These are not shocks. They are scheduled costs, and scheduled costs do not force political reversals. Now that the false endings are off the board, the more important question takes the stage. How does this war actually conclude? Two pathways exist. A military resolution, where one side imposes its will on the other completely, or a bargaining resolution, where the act of fighting itself reshapes the calculations of both sides until a deal becomes more rational than continued combat. The military path is worth examining first because the logic is cleaner. The stated objective of both Washington and Tel Aviv is regime change in Tehran. Full stop. For Iran, military survival therefore constitutes victory by default. And that default victory is genuinely achievable, because the Trump administration has ruled out a ground invasion, which means the entire American strategy rests on air power and the arsenal that supports it. Somewhere deep inside the Pentagon, analysts have calculated a minimum weapons threshold, the floor below which the United States absolutely cannot drop without compromising its broader strategic posture, including the China contingency. If the Iranian government is still functioning when American stockpiles hit that floor, the campaign ends. Trump announces that Iran's military capacity has been set back by years, frames that as a victory, and withdraws. The classified nature of those stockpile numbers is itself strategic. Revealing the floor would hand Tehran a countdown clock to operate against. How Washington achieves its own definition of victory is the more fascinating and more uncertain question, because what is unfolding right now is an experiment without a clear historical parallel. The administration has not publicly articulated the bridge between sustained bombardment and actual regime collapse. The logic appears to be, bomb the security apparatus into dysfunction, remove the physical deterrent that keeps ordinary Iranians off the streets, and then wait for the population to do what populations sometimes do when the machinery of state repression goes dark. Call it the, if you destroy it, they will rise doctrine. The preferred outcome from the White House's perspective would be a rapid civilian uprising, the Tehran equivalent of Kyiv in 2014. These cascades, when they happen fast. One unit of security forces concludes the math no longer works in the government's favor and steps back. That retreat reduces the incentive for the next unit to hold the line, which steps back, which reduces the incentive for the unit after that. The collapse accelerates under its own weight. The Pentagon's targeting of IRGC infrastructure and senior command figures is designed to accelerate exactly that sequence by dismantling the coercive architecture before civilians decide whether to move. The problem is that after more than a week of visible bombardment results, there are no reports of major Iranian population centers slipping out of government control. That is a significant data point. The IRGC is not simply a professional military force. It is an ideologically committed organization, and ideological commitment is precisely the variable that interrupts the cascade dynamic. Predicting the inflection point here is genuinely difficult. The alternative military path, engineering a conventional civil war by backing an armed opposition faction as a proxy ground force, comes with an immediate and serious problem. Civil wars are long. A decade is not an outlier. It is the historical average. Trump has been explicit that he has no appetite for extended engagements, and the 14 months of his second term have produced consistent evidence that he means it. A civil war timeline also collides directly with the strategic imperative of maintaining deterrence capacity against China. The math does not work unless the United States concede a credible rebellion and then step back into a limited support role while that rebellion achieves its own momentum. That requires a geography, specifically a safe zone where an opposition force can organize, arm, and operate without being immediately overrun. The leading candidate is Iran's Kurdish Northwest. Reporting has circulated suggesting CIA involvement with Kurdish elements either inside Iran or in northern Iraq, potentially aimed at carving out an autonomous zone as an operational base. Whether this is real activity or deliberate signaling designed to pull Iranian security forces away from the capital remains unclear, and that ambiguity is itself useful. But the Kurdish question carries a history that cannot be dismissed. George H.W. Bush encouraged a Kurdish uprising in 1991 and then declined to support it when it mattered. The Syrian Kurds absorbed a version of that lesson less than 2 months ago in 2026. Asking those same communities to absorb risk on Washington's behalf, against that backdrop, is a significant ask. And backing any armed faction inside Iran carries the same sectarian combustion risk that consumed so much of the post-invasion stability effort in Iraq. This is a pathway to victory, technically. It is not a pathway anyone should describe as clean. Which brings the analysis to the third resolution mechanism, and arguably the most underappreciated one: bargaining. Every war carries a built-in economic logic. Both sides absorb costs, and at some point the cost of continuing exceeds the value of the objective being fought over. When that calculation shifts, the incentive to negotiate a settlement rises. The central bargaining friction in this particular conflict is a timing problem. Anti-government sentiment inside Iran is currently near its peak. That sentiment is the American window of leverage. But public frustration with governments tends to decay over time, especially under sufficient pressure and repression. If the Iranian leadership stabilizes its domestic situation, if fear reasserts itself as the dominant social force, that window closes. The government would have no credible reason to offer lasting concessions, because the domestic pressure that made concessions necessary would no longer exist. The regime survives, the population complies, and Washington's strategic opening evaporates. Getting there, however, requires the Iranian government to execute a crackdown brutal enough to reimpose compliance without triggering the exact collapse it is trying to prevent. That is a needle with almost no margin for error. If the next figure to consolidate power in Tehran threads it, the war ends without regime change. Trump pivots to the armaments narrative, and the chapter closes. There is one final bargaining dynamic worth holding on to. Wars also end when both sides have been fighting long enough to remove all ambiguity about the other's resolve and capability. Bluffing becomes impossible once the battlefield has spoken clearly enough. At that point, a deal that reflects actual power realities becomes more rational than continued bloodshed. The irony of armed conflict is that fighting is often the only mechanism that generates the information necessary to make peace credible. The catch is that process takes time. The signals have not fully transmitted yet. Both sides are still in the phase where posture and reality have not fully converged. That convergence is coming, but we are not there yet. And before you go, if you want clear updates, timelines, and deep context on the world's biggest flashpoints, hit subscribe and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next briefing. This is WarScope Intelligence. See you in the next one.